Alright, so I need to talk to you about what just happened in Berea, because if you were anywhere near social media over the last few hours, you already know something's brewing. I'm not talking about a small story here. I'm talking about a full-blown quarterback controversy that just got a direct response from the top of the organization, and honestly, the way it played out tells you everything about where this Browns team really stands heading into the 2026 season. Let me set the scene for you first, because context matters here. Day 3 of training camp wrapped up, and normally that's just another rep-counting, depth chart watching kind of day. Nobody outside of Cleveland really cares about Day 3 of anybody's camp. But this wasn't a normal day. This was the day the crowd noise became the story. Not the plays. Not the install. The noise. Because every single time a certain rookie touched the field, the stands basically turned into a concert. Kids, grown adults, everybody, chanting one name over and over until it drowned out damn near everything else happening on that practice field. You know exactly who I'm talking about, Shedeur Sanders. And look, I've covered a lot of camps, a lot of quarterback battles, a lot of hype cycles. But there's something different about what's happening with Shedeur right now, and it's not just the talent, although that's obviously part of it. It's the emotional connection. It's the fact that an entire fan base that's been starving for hope, for an identity, for something to actually believe in, has attached itself to this young man before he's even thrown a real regular season pass. That's rare. That's the kind of thing that changes the entire temperature of an organization, whether ownership wants to admit it publicly or not. So naturally, when it came time for Jimmy Haslam to step up to the podium after practice, everybody wanted answers. And I mean everybody. Reporters were lined up ready to push, ready to press, ready to see if the man who owns this franchise would finally say the quiet part out loud. Here's the thing though, and this is where it gets interesting. The noise from the crowd was so loud in the background that reporters were physically struggling to even ask their questions clearly. Think about that for a second. The fan energy was so intense, it nearly disrupted an actual press conference involving the owner of an NFL franchise. That's not hype. That's not clickbait. That's real, tangible, in-the-air electricity. And I wanted you to feel that before I even get into what was said, because the setting is half the story here. Now let's get into what Haslam actually addressed, because he didn't dodge it. Not entirely anyway. When he was asked directly about heading back into camp still stuck in a two-quarterback race instead of having a clear-cut starter locked in, he opened up in a way that felt more honest than a lot of these scripted ownership answers usually feel. He talked about Deshaun Watson putting in the work, acknowledging, and this part stung a little if you're a realist, that Deshaun's last couple of seasons have been wiped out by brutal, season-ending injuries. That's not something you can spin. That's just the truth of where that situation sits. But in the same breath, he made a point of praising Shedeur specifically, saying the kid has been grinding all spring, showing up, putting in real work behind the scenes, not just riding a wave of hype from draft weekend or highlight reels. And here's where I want to slow down for a second, because this next part is the part that actually matters most if you're trying to understand how this front office is thinking. Haslam didn't sit there and promise a savior. He didn't come out and anoint anybody. Instead, he leaned into a broader point, one that I actually respect from an organizational standpoint, even if it's not the answer the fan base wants to hear emotionally. He basically said that every single team in this league is dealing with some version of the same question. 31 other franchises are all wrestling with roster construction, with finding their guy, with figuring out who's going to be the face of the franchise for the next decade. Cleveland isn't unique in that struggle, even if it feels like the most important quarterback decision in football when you're living inside the fan base. Then he shifted into talking about expectations, and this is where I think a lot of people are going to react emotionally instead of rationally, so let me break it down calmly. He didn't use the words high expectations. He specifically corrected that framing and said something closer to improved expectations. Now, if you're a fan who's been through the last couple of brutal seasons, that phrase might sting a little. It might feel like ownership is managing you down instead of promising you the world. But honestly, that's smart. That's disciplined. Teams that come out of nowhere and promise championships after 8-win seasons usually end up embarrassing themselves. Haslam is essentially saying, we know where we've been, we know the roster is young, and we're not going to insult your intelligence by pretending we're a finished product. And he backed that up with something that actually caught my attention more than anything else he said. He mentioned that this roster could realistically start double-digit players who are either rookies or in their second year in the league. Think about the magnitude of that. That's not a team quietly retooling with a couple of young pieces mixed into a veteran core. That's a team fundamentally rebuilding its identity through youth, all at once, in real time, under a national spotlight, with a rabid fan base watching every single snap. That's high risk. But if it hits, if even half of those young players develop the way the front office is clearly hoping, this franchise could look completely different by the midpoint of the season. Now let's get to the part that I think is actually the heart of this entire story, the part that made this press conference feel less like a routine camp update and more like a genuine acknowledgement of tension inside the building. A reporter basically called it what it is. They said it flat out, that there's almost an elephant in the room here, because you've got one quarterback in this competition who the fan base hasn't fully embraced emotionally, and another one who is, without exaggeration, wildly, overwhelmingly popular. That's not a hypothetical. That's not media narrative building. That's the literal sound you could hear echoing off the practice field every single rep. So the question became, does ownership have any kind of real strategy for managing that dynamic? Or are they just going to let it play out and hope it doesn't fracture the locker room or the fan base? And I have to be honest with you, the answer they gave was diplomatic, but it wasn't empty. It wasn't just PR fluff dressed up to sound good on camera. The response leaned into something that I actually think reflects how professional locker rooms function at the highest level. They basically said everybody's a fan of somebody. Some people love Deshaun, some people don't. Some people are drawn to another guy in that quarterback room, and some people aren't feeling it. But the players themselves, they don't get caught up in that noise the way we do from the outside. They're focused on one thing, and one thing only: winning football games. That's the job. That's the only currency that actually matters inside that building. Then it got a little more raw, a little more emotionally honest, and this is the part I want you to really sit with. There was a direct acknowledgement that going 8-9, back-to-back seasons is simply not acceptable for a franchise with this market, this ownership group, and this level of investment in the roster. And they didn't blame injuries, they didn't blame the schedule, they didn't make excuses. They pointed to missed opportunities, games that were right there for the taking, moments where this team had chances to close things out and just didn't get it done. That's accountability. That's a front office openly admitting that talent alone hasn't been the problem, execution and closing ability has been the actual issue. And then came the line that honestly might be the most quotable moment of the entire press conference, the one I think is going to get clipped and replayed constantly over the next few weeks. When asked about where this team's win total sits heading into the season, ownership didn't hedge. They said, in a moment of what felt like genuine confidence, that if the odds are set around 5.5 wins, they'd take the over without hesitation. Now, I don't know about you, but when I heard that, my ears perked up immediately, because ownership groups almost never publicly commit to a number like that. That's not a throwaway line, that's a stake in the ground. That's Jimmy Haslam essentially telling the entire football world, we believe in this roster more than the outside perception currently reflects. But here's where the story gets even more layered, and this is the part that I think a lot of casual fans are going to miss if they're just skimming headlines instead of really digging into the substance of what was said. When the conversation shifted toward the future, toward who's actually going to be the guy not just for this season, but for 2026 and beyond, ownership pumped the brakes hard. And I mean hard. There was a real reluctance to even engage with that timeline. The answer basically boiled down to this: it's way too early, way too premature, to be locking in a long-term answer at the quarterback position. Somebody could have a phenomenal year and lock the job down for years to come. Or, and this is the part that stings a little if you're emotionally attached to one guy over the other, neither quarterback might fully seize the opportunity, and this whole competition could roll right back into an open question again next offseason. What we did get, though, was a clear short-term marker. There was direct acknowledgement that by the time the regular season opener actually kicks off, there will be a starter. That much is locked in. The mystery isn't about whether a decision gets made, it's about who that decision favors. And honestly, based on everything I've watched, listened to, and broken down from this camp so far, I don't think that decision has been made yet, not internally, not even close. This still feels like a genuinely open competition, not a formality where one guy is just going through the motions before an inevitable announcement. Now here's something I really want to highlight, because it's subtle, but if you know how to read between the lines of these press conferences, it tells you a lot about how collaborative this decision-making process actually is. When pressed on how much say the coaching staff has in all of this, particularly the head coach and the quarterback's coach, the answer was clear. That decision doesn't rest solely with ownership. It's being shaped heavily by the football operations side of the building, the people actually in the meeting rooms, watching every single throw, every read, every decision under pressure during live practice reps. And that lines up with something else that's been floating around, something I think is honestly one of the more important storylines buried underneath all this quarterback drama. Because publicly, you'll hear conflicting messages depending on who's answering the question. At one point, it sounded like the general manager was pointing toward the head coach as the ultimate decision-maker on who starts. But then, separately, when the head coach himself was asked directly, the answer flipped the responsibility right back onto the players. The message there was essentially, this isn't a boardroom decision, this isn't a political decision, this is going to be earned or lost on the practice field and in preseason reps. Whoever performs, whoever proves it consistently when the lights are on, that's who's going to walk out of that tunnel as the starter. And honestly, I think that's the correct approach, even if it frustrates fans who want a definitive answer right now. Because the alternative, naming a starter in April or May based on draft capital or fan excitement alone, that's how organizations set themselves up for disaster. That's how you end up benching a guy in October because you rushed the decision back in the spring just to satisfy public pressure. The fact that this competition is still fully alive in August, with both quarterbacks still pushing, still grinding, still uncertain of their status, that's actually a healthy sign of legitimate competition, not dysfunction. So where does that leave us heading into day 4 and beyond? Honestly, right where we started, except now we have direct, on-record confirmation from ownership that this competition is real, that the front office is confident in the roster's overall trajectory, and that no matter how loud that crowd gets every single practice, no matter how many jerseys you see in the stands, no matter how viral these training camp clips go, the final call is going to come down to what happens on that field. Snap after snap, rep after rep, all the way up until the first regular season kickoff. I'll be honest with you, as someone who watches these situations unfold constantly, this is exactly the kind of storyline that can define an entire season before a single meaningful game is even played. The pressure on both quarterbacks right now is enormous. One is fighting to prove his body can hold up and that his talent can finally translate into sustained, healthy production. The other is fighting to prove that all of that hype, all of that emotional investment from the fan base is actually backed up by consistent, disciplined, professional-level execution against real competition, not just excitement from an adoring crowd. And that tension, that exact tension we heard bubbling underneath every question in that press conference, is going to follow this team through every single practice, every preseason snap, and honestly, probably well into the regular season, no matter who ultimately wins the job. Because in a market this passionate, with a fan base this hungry for stability and hope after years of disappointment, there's no version of this quarterback competition that ends quietly. Somebody's going to be disappointed, somebody's going to be vindicated, and we're all going to be watching every single step of the way.